Imagine you spent 3 years doing nothing but accumulate wealth, trading, fishing, borrowing, calling in every favor you had. And then in a single week, you gave all of it away. Every blanket, every canoe, every piece of copper you had ever accumulated. All right, you did not do this because you were forced to. You did not do it out of generosity. You did it because giving everything away was the most powerful move available to you. In the world of the Pacific Northwest tribes, giving was strategy, not charity. And the more you gave, the more powerful you became. For over 1,000 years, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast built an economic system that operated on rules almost exactly opposite to the ones we use today. The Kwakwaka'wakw, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, and a dozen other nations lived along one of the richest coastlines on Earth. Dense salmon runs, towering cedar forests, and a climate mild enough to produce food surpluses that most ancient societies never experienced. Okay, and what they did with that surplus is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of wealth. They called it the potlatch. The word comes from the Chinook trade language and roughly translates as to give. But calling it a ceremony about giving is like calling the New York Stock Exchange a place where people trade pieces of paper. The description is technically accurate and misses everything that made the system work. Okay, when you hosted a potlatch, you invited chiefs and nobles from neighboring nations. You prepared for months, sometimes years. You accumulated goods, blankets, carved cedar boxes, canoes, and after European contact, Hudson's Bay Company blankets became the dominant currency of the system. Then you gave them away. But every gift you gave carried legal weight. When a guest accepted a gift from you, they were not just saying thank you. They were making a public acknowledgement in front of hundreds of witnesses. By accepting your gift, they were legally confirming your claim to a fishing territory, a hereditary title, a ranked social position, or the right to perform a specific ceremony or use a specific family crest. The gift was payment for testimony. Every person who accepted something from you was being paid to remember and to publicly confirm what you owned and who you were. You did not need a written deed. You did not need a court. You had witnesses who had been compensated to remember. The system went even deeper than that. The blankets you gave away did not simply disappear into the community. They entered a lending economy with documented interest rates. Chiefs borrowed blankets from wealthier chiefs to finance their own potlatches. Franz Boas, the anthropologist who documented the Kwakwaka'wakw in the 1880s and 90s, recorded interest rates of 100% per year. Borrow 100 blankets at the start of the year and you owed 200 by year's end. In cases of debt restructuring, rates could reach 230%. Yeah, what Boas documented was a credit market operating without money as we define it today. The chief who gave the most blankets was converting his wealth from stored goods into something worth more than goods, social obligation. Every person who accepted a gift now owed him a return gift of higher value at a future potlatch. Every borrower who took his blankets was legally committed to repay with interest. The chief was investing his wealth in the only asset class that actually compounded in his world, which was relationships. At the very top of the value hierarchy sat the coppers. They were sheets of beaten metal shaped like shields, roughly 2 feet tall, each one given a name and a transaction history maintained through oral tradition across generations. The names carried their own weight. Other coppers are ashamed to look at it, making the house empty of blankets. Each name described a transaction so significant that it became the copper's permanent identity, and a copper's value was cumulative by design. Every time one changed hands at a potlatch, its worth increased, because its history of significant transactions attached to it, the way a record of verified sales attaches to a property. A copper's value came from its record, one that had passed through multiple major potlatches and been used to confirm significant territorial claims before the most important chiefs on the coast, was worth vastly more than one with no provenance attached. All right, think of it this way. The copper was not merely a prestige object. It was a living ledger of agreements, witnessed obligations, and financial history stretching back through generations. The most valuable coppers on the coast were worth the equivalent of 75,000 Hudson's Bay blankets. And then comes the move that Western observers found completely incomprehensible. A chief would acquire one of these coppers at enormous cost, display it before hundreds of witnesses, and then destroy it, breaking it apart, hurling it into the sea, or feeding it to the fire. The logic of this was precise. I have so much surplus that I can obliterate this copper worth 75,000 blankets, and it will not diminish me. The gap between us is so absolute that I can destroy what you are still saving up to afford. The rival who received this challenge had to respond in kind. He had to either destroy a copper of equal or greater value or publicly admit he could not match the gesture. If he could not respond, he lost face before every witness in the room. His territorial claims, his rank title, his ability to lead were suddenly in question. The grease feast worked the same way. The host would pour box after box of Olichin oil directly onto the ceremonial fire until the flames roared to the ceiling, singeing the clothing of the nearest guests. The more oil you burned, the richer you declared yourself. The room smelled of burning fish oil and cedar smoke, and everyone in it understood exactly what was being communicated. The potlatch itself took place inside the big house, a massive cedar structure capable of holding 800 people. The interior was a single room dominated by a central fire, the walls darkened and glossy from years of accumulated smoke. Giant carved welcome figures stood at the water's edge outside, facing the sea, arms open or hands shading their eyes, waiting for arriving canoes. Guests were seated in ranked order, with the highest nobles closest to the host and commoners along the edges. The ceremony could last several days, with dancers moving in a counterclockwise direction. And embedded inside the major potlatches was the hamatsa, the cannibal dance, the most prestigious initiation available in the society, reserved for sons of chiefs. The novice would disappear into the forest for months and return wearing the great bird masks, the huck's hook with its long beak, the crooked beak, the raven. Each mask was the hereditary property of a specific family, worth generations of territorial rights. Yeah, when the ceremony ended, you had accomplished something no court, no bank, and no government could have provided: public confirmation of your wealth and your territorial rights, witnessed by every important person in the region, enforced by community memory that would last as long as the witnesses lived and taught their children. In 1885, the Canadian government made the potlatch illegal. The official justification was that it was wasteful and incompatible with civilized progress. The real motivation was simpler. The potlatch was the legal foundation of indigenous territorial authority. When a chief confirmed his rights to a salmon fishery through a potlatch, those rights were enforceable because hundreds of witnesses had publicly acknowledged them. Generations of territorial memory lived inside that ceremony. The potlatch was the court system, the property title registry, and the governance process all functioning simultaneously in a single event. All right, banning the potlatch meant deleting the legal mechanism through which indigenous territorial claims were established and enforced. And without that mechanism, the resource extraction and land dispossession the government intended to carry out could proceed without navigating those claims. Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs and the man most responsible for the ban's enforcement, is remembered most for stating that the goal of his department was to kill the Indian in the child. The potlatch ban was the same logic applied to economies. On Christmas Day, 1921, a Kwakwaka'wakw chief named Dan Cranmer hosted what became the largest potlatch ever documented in the historical record. He held it on Village Island, a remote location, specifically chosen to avoid the Indian agents assigned to enforce the ban. The ceremony lasted 6 days. Cranmer distributed goods valued at hundreds of thousands of today's dollars. Gas boats, pool tables, sewing machines, button blankets, and cash. The Indian agents found out. They arrived with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. 45 people were arrested. 20 of them were given a choice: surrender your ceremonial objects or go to prison. 22 chose prison rather than hand over the regalia. Those objects carried the full weight of hereditary rights. Generations of territorial claims built into every mask and copper. When Indian agent Halliday confiscated 300 cubic feet of material and shipped it to museums in Ottawa and Toronto, he was seizing the financial records, the title deeds, and the court documents of an entire legal system. The families who owned those objects valued the coppers alone at $35,000. The Department of Indian Affairs paid $1,485 for everything and paid nothing at all for the coppers. Yeah, for 66 years after the ban, the potlatch continued underground. Communities held ceremonies disguised as Christmas parties, church gatherings, and sports events. The village of Gwayi became a known refuge where approaching boats could be spotted early enough to hide the regalia. The ceremony the government tried to erase kept functioning in secret, generation after generation. In 1951, the Indian Act was quietly amended and the ban was simply removed, with no apology and no formal acknowledgement of what the ban had cost. The law that had imprisoned people for dancing was deleted as a bureaucratic line edit. Okay, the following year, Kwakwaka'wakw chief and master carver Mungo Martin held the first public potlatch since 1885 in Thunderbird Park in Victoria, on the grounds of the Provincial Museum. He had spent years recording 400 songs and oral histories before they could be lost. The choice of venue was deliberate. The institution that collected Northwest Coast objects now hosted the ceremony that gave those objects meaning. All right, the fight to recover what had been seized lasted 50 more years. In 1980, the Umista Cultural Center opened in Alert Bay to house the repatriated ceremonial objects. An elder who had not seen certain masks since they were taken in 1922 recognized them by name when they came home. And the potlatch's legal function never fully stopped. In 2024, the Haida Nation signed agreements with both the provincial and federal governments, formally recognizing Aboriginal title across all of Haida Gwaii, roughly 10,000 square kilometers of Pacific coastline. The first time in Canadian history that a colonial government recognized Indigenous title over an entire territory without a court order. The legal standing that made that possible had been maintained through potlatch governance across 6 generations of colonial denial. All right, the potlatch operated on a principle that the modern world keeps rediscovering, that giving creates more durable power than keeping. And we have built entire economies around that same logic without always naming what we are doing. When Warren Buffett and Bill Gates launched the Giving Pledge in 2010, recruiting billionaires to publicly commit to giving away more than half their fortunes, they were running a public competition in generosity where the most generous signatories earned the most status. Yeah, witnesses acknowledged each commitment. Mackenzie Scott's giving, unconditional and anonymous as possible, reads as more powerful precisely because it refuses to accept the recognition that giving earns in the same way that throwing a copper into the sea read as more powerful than simply giving one away. The open source software economy runs on the same logic. Programmers give away their best work and earn the only currency that matters in that world: reputation and influence. A senior engineer's GitHub contribution history is the modern equivalent of a copper's transaction record. The value accumulates with every public exchange. In every system where social status is competed for through visible generosity, the potlatch mechanism is running. You give away what you have, the community witnesses it, and you become owed. Yeah, the potlatch was a rational response to a world without banks, courts, or written contracts, where the only legally enforceable currency was witnessed obligation. A chief who gave away 10,000 blankets did not lose 10,000 blankets. He acquired 10,000 blankets worth of enforceable claims on every person who accepted one. His wealth was stored in relationships, in the web of obligations surrounding him. The people who called this system primitive replaced it with one that has generated more concentrated wealth and more inequality than the potlatch ever produced. The salmon fisheries that indigenous communities managed sustainably for 3,000 years through that ceremony have been pushed repeatedly to the edge of collapse under the management that replaced it. The deepest truth the potlatch holds is also the one hardest to sit with. Your real wealth was always the sum of what others owed you, and the fastest way to build that sum was to give in a way that was witnessed, public, and beyond what anyone expected you could afford. The potlatch understood that for 1,000 years before anyone called it a gift economy. It is still running. If you have never thought about money this way, it might be worth starting now.